Good morning, and thank you all for coming to our first lunchtime visiting artist presentation. Especially thanks to faculty Martha and Sean for really spearheading this conversation. I just know it's going to be a really valuable part of our college's archive and the work with the wonderful Lydia. Of course, we all know the fantastic Lydia Gordon, who's the Associate Curator for Exhibitions and Research at the Peabody Essex Museum, as well as Montserrat Faculty. She earned her BA in Art Administration from Simmons College in 2010 and her dual MA in Art History, Theory, and Criticism, Art Administration, and Policy from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago in 2017. At PIM, Lydia helps organize complex exhibitions and publication projects, including Playtime, a digital catalog that accompanied it, and of course the fantastic Hans Hofmann exhibition last year, which we were so thankful to kind of have a small little part of. Today, she's here to talk about the exhibition she curated entitled Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. I'll let you take it away, Lydia. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you all so much for coming to this talk. I miss teaching this semester, and I miss working with you all, and so I just hope that this lecture can provide some content and help move conversations forward in the classrooms, but also across the campus community at large. I will just say that truck is still outside my building, so it might, there might be some noise, but here we are teaching and lecturing virtually in 2020, not a surprise here. So I'm gonna go ahead and start to share my screen. Great. So the lecture I'm going to deliver today is entitled Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. This lecture focuses on one series of paintings. Sorry, there's the truck. Entitled Struggle from the History of the American People by modern American artist Jacob Lawrence. This was an exhibition I helped organize at the Peabody Essex Museum, and it's a nationally touring exhibition currently on view at the Met in New York City. So firstly, I'd like to sort of introduce Jacob Lawrence. So here is an archival black and white image of Jacob Lawrence in 1958 in front of one of the panels of this struggle series. So this is the moment, this is the crescendo sort of the presentation of this narrative. But we're going to back up a little bit and talk about who Jacob Lawrence was and how he came to paint this extraordinary series of paintings. So Jacob Lawrence was born in 1917 in Atlantic City. He moved to Harlem in 1930 with his mom and sister. It's really in Harlem at sort of the tails of the Harlem Renaissance that he garners his artistic training. So he's learning his artistic practice in the workshops in Harlem, which was a community effort by the WPA led by Augusta Savage and Charles Alston. And it's in these workshops that Lawrence develops two things that are pretty important to this series that I'm going to discuss. So firstly, they encourage the students to look around them, to find inspiration in their community, in their family's history, in their neighbor's history, in their neighborhood. And so from there, Jacob Lawrence really becomes curious about the history of Harlem, the history of his family, and how they came to be in this really vibrant artistic community. He also develops a strategy for telling stories. So Jacob Lawrence is known as sort of a master storyteller in his art. And how he does that is he develops a narrative invention. So he uses multiple panels, pretty small scale panels typically, to tell a story. And he's interested in the story of Black Americans. So coming out of the Harlem art workshops, coming out of this schooling in which he develops his understanding of narrative and how to tell this story, at a really young age, Lawrence paints what is probably his most famous narrative series called the Migration series. And the paintings that you see on the screen are actually just images from my cell phone of some of the panels of this 60-panel narrative. So in 1941, Jacob Lawrence decides he wants to tell the story of the Great Migration, of his family's history, of his community's history, of the mass migration of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial northern cities at the beginning of the 20th century. This mass migration is depicted here across 60 panels. They're pretty small scale. They're about 12 by 16 panels, and he uses tempera paint. So the images that you see here are several panels throughout the series. And you can also tell sort of how he paints them, how he lays down color. They're pretty visually cohesive. And how he accomplished this in Migration series is that he laid down color iteratively. So he laid down all of the browns across all the panels, the yellows, the blues, and the greens. And so when they're installed together, they tell this amazing narrative, but they also visually go together and sort of look complete. He painted this when he was 23 years old. And at that time, a gallerist who owned Downtown Gallery, Edith Halpert, was interested in expanding her roster at her gallery downtown. And so she published these Migration series panels in Fortune magazine. And it's really this spread in this magazine that skyrockets Lawrence at an incredibly young age to stardom. So because of this publication, two major modern art institutions, the Phillips Collection in DC and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, split the series and purchase 30 panels each. So the Phillips in DC own the odd number of panels, and MoMA owns the even number of panels. And this was huge. I mean, Lawrence really is catapulted into a very highly segregated white art world at the age of 20. And he's one of the first Black artists to enter the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And it's really this sort of moment that he steps on into his like upward trajectory as a major modern artist. And here are just some archival images of a really young Lawrence showing his work to the Baltimore Museum of Art on the left, and then on the right is an image of young Lawrence with the rest of Edith Halpert's artists. And you'll notice, you know, he is the only Black artist in this downtown gallery. And here's an installation image of part of the Migration series, and they're actually currently up at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. So again, from this installation image, you can kind of get the sense of the scale, and again, how they sort of look like they go together. So from Migration series, Lawrence also begins to garner some pretty real world experiences. So after Migration, after he paints Migration, he enters the Navy, and it's really in the Navy that he's said to have experienced the most democratic society. He is on one of the first integrated troop ships, and he is tasked with being the artist on the ground. And so here's an image of a young Lawrence showing and generating artwork while he's in the Navy. So he has this international context, this international experience. At this time, he also moves out of Harlem. So he and his wife, the artist Gwendolyn Knight, moved to Studevant Heights in Brooklyn, and he begins to also teach at Pratt in this time period sort of after Migration series. So we're sort of moving through the decades here a little bit and sort of building up to this moment where Lawrence becomes a more mature artist. There are also all these things that are, of course, happening in the world at mid-century. This is the dawn of the modern civil rights movement. And so this image of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1955 at the first day of the Montgomery bus boycotts, this is the moment in history where, in American history especially, where Lawrence is experiencing this reckoning, these issues of segregated schools. He's also very much an artist, occupying this insider-outsider experience because he is collected, by these major art institutions, but he's not necessarily getting the same accolades as his as the other white artists. So this is all sort of fodder for his narrative series that I'm going to talk about today, which is entitled Struggle. What's also happening at this moment, mid-century in the 1950s, in terms of social and political history, is that this is, of course, the era of McCarthyism. So Senator Joseph McCarthy is creating these committees to investigate un-American acts. Communism was a really great threat to this government, and a lot of Jacob Lawrence's colleagues and friends and fellow artists went before these committee hearings. And Lawrence himself lived under FBI surveillance his entire life. So it's really this moment of questioning and reckoning that Lawrence decides he's going to paint another narrative series. So he paints a total of 10 narratives in his whole life. And this one that I'm going to talk about was painted in this environment. So how does Jacob Lawrence respond to these moments of the civil rights and McCarthyism and these questioning of larger society? Is that he goes to the library. So Lawrence is a researcher. He's an artist researcher, and he returns to the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which is, of course, now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. This library, this branch of the library, was his childhood library. It's where he went to research all of his narratives, including migration, to find the stories and the texts and the accounts of those that had experienced this history. So what Lawrence is looking for in this particular project in the middle of the 1950s is he's interested in American history. He's interested in broadening sort of this framework in which he had typically and previously interrogated through Black history, but he's interested in an inclusive history. How did we get to this moment? Who contributed? And why aren't they prevalent in the dominant narrative? So the archival image that you see on the screen is an image from the 1930s. This is at the reading room in the library. And what the librarians and archivists are doing is that they are cutting out contemporary, to their time, articles from newspapers, periodicals, broadsides that relate to Black culture, and then they're pasting them in binders. And these became what's known as the clipping files. So Lawrence, as a researcher, as a historian, not only had access to the great collection of books and manuscripts from the library, but also these clipping files. Again, thinking about what's going on in the world in the 1950s, this became extremely important as sort of Lawrence synthesized his project to create this American narrative, this inclusive story of American history. The library, of course, serves as inspiration for Lawrence throughout his career. And the image of the painting on the right is an image of the library that he continues to paint long after this particular series. So here's an image of what those clipping files look like. Unfortunately, the originals are missing. We don't know where they are, but we have facsimiles, which is great, of these clipping files. So we could go through and sort of see what Lawrence was seeing. These are clippings that relate to the Boston Massacre, and particularly Crispus Attucks as it relates to the history of Boston and how we educate our students about Crispus Attucks in schools, in the classrooms. So all of these clippings and all of these published articles are in tandem with the books that Lawrence is reading in the library. And we know what books he sourced because he lists them in a plan of project in which he used to apply for grant funding. So these are the 7 books that Lawrence cites in his bibliography. And you'll notice that, well, I don't know if you noticed, but just so you know, these are pretty sort of standardized history texts. Like these are what would be included in an American history class in 1954. So he's looking at the dominant narrative, and then he's also using the material from the Schomburg, and he's doing almost like a cross analysis about what's missing, what isn't there. And this is how, and this is why he decides to paint what he does, but also title the paintings, which he does, which I'll talk a little bit about. So this plan of project develops into this proposal, this American series proposal. And the words that Lawrence uses to describe this narrative series, the paintings which I propose to do will depict the struggles of a people to create a nation and their attempt to build a democracy. So what we know from this plan of project and what Lawrence himself hopes for in terms of what this series will depict is that he's using the framework of struggle. He's using struggle as a way to investigate all sorts of episodes, all sorts of people, all sorts of contributions to this American cause, right? It's not just a Black history. It's not just a history of women. It's a history of everyone. Everyone is in this narrative. And what comes out of it is the series entitled Struggle from the History of the American People, 1954 to 1956. So here is a snapshot of all these different panels and what they look like. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do some deep dives into a couple of them and then talk about the resources Lawrence used to generate the image, but also generate the words that went with the image. And I'll also talk about why some of these squares are blank. So the first panel of this series, this is a series of 30 paintings, is this image. Again, this looks pretty big on your screen, but if you can imagine, these are 12 by 16 tempera panels, tempera paint on hardboard panels. So what you're looking at is sort of 2 different components of an artwork. You have this painting where we see this figure pointing, this sort of galvanizing motion, these folks raising their fists in this collective effort. You also see there's blood on the wall. You see a woman, if I can, I don't know if you, oh, here, okay. You see a woman clutching her child, and then these figures in shadow here. So all of these panels are paired with a title caption. So the title caption for panel number 1 is "Life so dear, peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery, Patrick Henry." This is a speech in which Patrick Henry, who was an attorney, he was an orator, He delivered a speech at the Virginia Convention in 1775 that was trying to rally the colonists against the Patriot cause, against the British oppression, right? This cause for independence. Most people, if they know this speech, they know the lines, "Give me liberty or give me death." But Lawrence does not excerpt those lines. He excerpts this question that centralizes the contradictions of slavery as the beginning of this American history narrative. And then, of course, he paints this galvanizing motion, this scene where, of course, there is always blood. So there's also this violence, this question of what's it going to take to achieve these goals that are laid out by Henry and sort of this collective effort to be free. Panel 2 is an example where not every panel has a caption. Not every panel is titled using first-person accounts. Most of them are, but sometimes, especially in this case, they're titled with the events, the historical events that the paintings depict. So Massacre in Boston is the title for this one, the Boston Massacre, which we sort of know a lot, especially through another visual representation of this scene, which is Paul Revere's engraving. So Revere's engraving was largely reproduced after the event and sort of included as propaganda for American independence. But Lawrence's painting looks incredibly different. And the clipping files I showed you from at the beginning were in relation to contemporary events related to the Boston Massacre. So what he's doing is he is reinserting the central figure into this American narrative, into the dominant narrative. So how he's doing that is he is visually composing using elements of design to draw our eye to this central figure down here. And this figure is meant to represent Crispus Attucks, who was the first to die in the conflict and the first to die in the American Revolution. Attucks was a man of African and Native descent. He is seen here clutching, dying, as his comrades behind him continue to defend the colonists against the British, who were using guns and ammunition. So Lawrence also makes a choice not to depict the British or those firing. So he's really sort of focusing in on those that are struggling, right, to against oppression. And Revere does not include Attucks at all in his engraving. It's sort of whitewashed this figure out of the dominant narrative. And it's not actually until abolition that Attucks gets inserted back into the visual representation of this historical moment. So here's an installation image of the first 3 panels at PEM. So you can see, again, just in terms of scale, how intimate they really are. Lawrence, as he did for all of his narrative series, he really envisioned this as work you could hold in your hand, right? He wanted to make this accessible. He wanted folks to feel like they could see themselves in these actions, in these paintings. But I hope you also notice how big the title captions are as they relate to the paintings. So we made this choice at PEM in that the title captions were a central component because it's really the relationship between the words that are on the wall and largely first-person accounts and the relationship with the image. So the 2 components create the work of art. I'm not going in order. I'm not going to talk about all 30, so I'm going to skip around a little bit, but this is panel 5, and it's also the title of our book that we created. So the painting, the image, is this violent uprising of enslaved peoples rising against their white oppressors, and through swords and daggers. There are men in chains. There's always blood in these panels. It's this incredibly violent altercation, this violent scene. What's interesting is that Lawrence paints this, but he decides to excerpt from this petition. So this petition, in which the words, "We have no property, we have no wives," etc., is a petition that was submitted by an enslaved man named Felix to the Massachusetts Bay colony, in which he petitioned his freedom by appealing to almost the religious right that we are all children of God, and we all deserve to be free. This petition, of course, and the freedom was denied. But this sort of nonviolent approach to petitioning one's freedom is not exactly what Lawrence paints, right? He paints the violence. And so we've done a lot of this sort of reckoning, again, between the words and the image, and thinking about sort of the 1950s and the civil rights movements and these different paths one can take towards attaining one's freedom. Of the violence and the nonviolence, of course, I think is predicated on this relationship between the petition Lawrence excerpted and, of course, the image. So it's not always a one-to-one relationship. And here's just an image of this petition that is, readily available in the archives and in the Massachusetts Historical Archives, where we could read Felix's words. The next panel is panel 6. And Lawrence excerpts the last line of the Declaration of Independence. So thinking about American history and this Declaration of Independence, which is actually a non-legal binding document, but rather a pledge that we all have to take on this burden to uphold freedoms for everyone. If you're not free, I'm not free. If I'm not free, you're not free. And he pairs this excerpted line from this pledge with a lone farmer, sort of carrying this burden, this wagon load of hay. He set his rifle aside, but of course there's still blood. This fight is not over, even though we declare ourselves to move forward to achieve freedom for all. The battle is ongoing. So panel 10 of this series, which out of the 30 panels, panel 10 is in the section where Lawrence is looking at the battles. So the first section is sort of leading up to the Declaration, and then the middle section are these battles that American and the Continental Army were fighting against the British, who were much more organized, had a lot more resources. It's sort of amazing that we were able to win any of these battles. And so what Lawrence does is he takes a pretty popular historical event in the crossing of the Delaware. So this is really well known. It's in all the history books that he's looking at, but he paints a really abstracted panel that is so vibrant with color. This blue just totally pops off the board here, and he has these huddled figures in these boats that are so close together here. And they're all carrying, they have their bayonets, so there's lots of points. I mean, and he also, of course, still includes, the blood on the ships. So as these ships are they're almost like rocking and really struggling, to maintain balance in this body of water. What Lawrence is doing visually in terms of what he paints is emphasizing the collective effort, right? There's no one protagonist in this painting. And of course, he pairs it with this first-person account from Tench Tillman, who was Washington's aide-de-camp. And in this letter that Tillman pens, he is paying homage to those nameless soldiers that took the risk to cross the Delaware in freezing conditions in the middle of the night on, Christmas Eve to surprise the Hessians in Trenton. So again, this relationship between image and text makes us really think about those that have been underrepresented from the dominant narrative of this particular story. And just to do a little compare and contrast, both of these paintings are owned by the Met. And Emanuel Leutz's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware is what's mostly reproduced in history books. And it's very clear in Leutz's painting, who Washington is. He's literally bathed in this halo of light, leading the soldiers forward here. Just also to give you some more perspective on that this is really Lawrence's history painting like you've never seen it before. I mean, the Leutze is huge, right? Most folks, I think of American history paintings as, epically large in these gilded frames, right? Lawrence's narrative is composed of intimate panels, but when they're all together, have this incredible impact on this story of American history. So panel 11 is really unique in terms of how close Lawrence sort of zooms in on this really intimate individual moment between these two figures. So there's this kind of awkward whisper exchange between these two figures here. You're not quite sure who is like on which side. And then you have this title caption, which is a whole bunch of numbers. And then, from an informer's coded message. So this is a really good example that I tend to use to explain and show and demonstrate how Lawrence used his research materials to produce the title captions, but also the paintings. So because we know the books that Lawrence used, pre-COVID, we were able to have them out in the gallery at Penn. And so the 7 books that you see in the sort of library section were the 7 books that Lawrence lists in his bibliography. In one of these books, which is titled The Secret History of the American Revolution, it's from the 1940s, there is this page in which the author is talking about Benedict Arnold and the sort of story and historical account of Arnold's treason. And so what this page shows in the book is a figure of the note, of the handwritten note that Benedict Arnold had in his pocket when he was discovered to be a traitor. And in this note is a numerical, it's a numerical system that communicates location. So what he was doing is he was communicating Washington's location to Cornwallis. So Lawrence, we know, saw this page, saw this figure of this note in this book, and he used it to title caption the title of panel 11. So those 120.9. So on and so forth are excerpted actually from the note that Arnold had in his pocket. And here's just another installation image of panel 10, panel 11, and then panel 12, the next one, which I'm going to talk about, in which Lawrence elevates a historical account of women's contribution to the American Revolution. So the next panel is this one. It's entitled "And a Woman Mans a Cannon." Lawrence was very much inspired by not what was in the history books, because there was nothing in the history books about women's contribution to the revolution, but about this sort of contemporary moment in the 1950s where Molly Corbin's remains were discovered and then transported to West Point. And Molly Corbin was, well, she's depicted as this figure here. And she is, she's known for her bravery in the Battle of Fort Washington. She accompanied her husband, who was to man the cannon, one of the cannons, and he was injured and actually killed in action during the battle. And you can actually see his body down here. And she stepped into this position and fired the cannon, supposedly with great accuracy, but she also drew a lot of enemy fire. And Corbin, was celebrated for her heroism in the moment, but for the rest of her life really struggled because we didn't have processes or support for female veterans. And so she actually lived the rest of her life sort of in destitute, because she was physically hurt, trying to achieve any sort of pension that her male veteran counterparts was granted by the government. So here's a contemporary, article that was published in the New York Times that Lawrence would have seen about this tribute to this female veteran, this heroine of the Revolution, and sort of get sort of inspired by the story in which he inserts, her story in the larger American history narrative. Panel 13 is a panel that sort of ends this first battle section. It's called Victory and Defeat. It marks the surrender at Yorktown, which is interesting because this moment occurs after the siege, a 22-day siege, in which the Continental Army successfully defeats the British Army. And ceremoniously, the generals are supposed to surrender their swords to one another, sort of this symbolic moment that the battle is over. So what Lawrence does is he paints, the receiving hand of America and the extended arm of the British, but they're still holding on to this sword, right? Whoops. And this pause, between the hands is pretty pregnant. It's almost like this isn't quite over yet. And it's not. That's why we have 15 more panels of this series. So there are 2 peace panels in the struggle series. This is the first one. And again, they sort of like bookend these battle scenes. The reason that this image is in black and white is because we don't know where this painting is. This image is from the last time this painting was reproduced. It was reproduced in a book in the 1960s. So we don't actually know, what color it was, what the sky looked like, what the flowers looked like. And the reason that we don't know what it looks like is because the Struggle series is the only narrative series by Jacob Lawrence that was dispersed. So the image that you see here on the screen is excerpted from an agreement that his gallerist, Charles Allen, brokered with the collector. I hope you've seen or sort of picked up on just how complex this American history narrative is. Allen tried his best to sell it to the major museums that had fostered Lawrence's career, but quite frankly, they weren't ready. They weren't ready for an inclusive representation of American history. And so he struggled to sell it. And he sold it finally after several years of mounting the panels twice. And so in this deal, which was made with William Myers, who was a collector in Long Island, what was left out of this agreement was that William Myers had the opportunity to resell the paintings individually. And that's exactly what he did. So between 1958 and the end of the century, he sold individual paintings to institutions, to private collectors. And so this project, this Struggle Series project, is really a reunion. It's a way to recapitulate, the lost narrative series of Jacob Lawrence. So that's why we don't know where some of them are. Panel 18 is just a really wonderful example of Lawrence as a master colorist. This is part of the series that begins to look at America trying to figure out its position both internally and externally on an international stage, on a world stage. Panel 18 is representing the historical event of the Corpse of Discovery. So Sacagawea here leading Lewis and Clark across to the west, in particular this moment across the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. And what Lawrence paints in this painting is Sacagawea negotiating their pass through the Shoshone people's lands of Montana. So she's negotiating with their chief, Kakamawit here. And what's happening in this moment of negotiation and conversation is that they begin to recognize each other and realize that they're actually talking to their sibling. So Sacagawea and Kakamawit had been long separated since childhood. Sacagawea was previously enslaved. And so this moment is like a tender reunion of family. And this is the moment that Lawrence emphasizes, right? He doesn't emphasize, Lewis and Clark, even though they're sort of pictured here, but he paints this sibling reunion. And what's also amazing is just how Lawrence uses the color to emphasize symbolically this love. If you'll notice, how he uses the reds and then the blues, they sort of create this heart shape in the middle of the painting. And then Lawrence excerpts this letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Lewis and Clark about how to, of course, conduct themselves on this journey, which we know foreshadows the ongoing struggles of Native American peoples to attain any sort of freedom in America, on the land that they have been on for millennia. And here's just an installation image of this panel. I'm probably not supposed to have favorites, but I do, and this is it. So that's why I just wanted you to see just how gorgeous this panel really is. Panel 19 Lawrence is beginning to look at what's largely considered the second great battle of American independence, which is the Battle of 1812. So these are battles in the 19th century that are trying to establish America on an international stage, but Britain is oppressing the trade between America and all these other different European and world countries by impressing soldiers. So what they're doing is they're capturing American Navy soldiers and forcing them to serve on British ships for Britain. And what Lawrence paints here are these soldiers, their heads hung low in front of a British colonel, but of course they're bound, right? They're in bondage. They're wrapped up. The words here, that title caption, are from Madison when he went before the government and said that this was the gravest mistake. This is the gravest threat to America, to the United States, and we need to do something to protect our American soldiers. The sort of panel that ends these 1812 battles is the Battle of New Orleans, which is seen in this painting. This was an incredibly bloody, with a really high death toll, battle in which the Americans, which I will say, the Battle of New Orleans was fought with a diverse group of combatants. Jackson's army were comprised of Creoles, Kentuckians, enslaved peoples, freemen, fighting against this cause, this American cause. And what they did, they dug sort of a trench along the Mississippi, put up their bayonets, and then the British just fell on them. So what is being depicted in this painting is the soldiers looking down sort of at the massacre that lay below them. And then Lawrence excerpts Jackson's recollection of the battle, in which he's sort of giving credit to the collective effort of his army. But it was full of carnage, the Battle of New Orleans, which is unfortunate because the panel that follows the Battle of New Orleans is another peace panel. And this panel marks the historical event of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. And this was a treaty that was signed between British and American forces in Belgium that officially ended the impressment and ended the War of 1812, these maritime battles. And unfortunately, the treaty was signed before Jackson and his army went into battle. But the news of the treaty had not gotten back yet. So all of those lives lost in vain. The panel here is of nature. So again, these sort of feeble flowers trying to grow from the scorched earth. And they're fragile, right? Like America's trying to regrow again. But of course, we cannot forget that we have that slavery is still legal, if not proliferating in the South due to the cotton gin. So at the same time that America is trying to establish itself in an international platform, we are still enslaving people, and we are still existing in this contradiction of freedom. And so Lawrence continues to remind us, of these histories. So the really gruesome sort of violent image here of the enslaved and wounded men struggling against their white captives and struggling for control of these weapons. The title caption that goes with this painting is excerpted from a correspondence between two enslaved peoples in Georgia and North Carolina that were planning a slave revolt. So what's also missing in the dominant history of American history, of course, are the large amount of slave revolts that were organized in the 19th century. And so This revolt was actually suppressed because the correspondence was found and published in the newspaper. So this one didn't happen, but Lawrence uses that and the power to actually image the violence and the revolt and what it takes to attain freedom for all. The last panel of this series is this one. It is looking west. Again, thinking about America, trying to figure out, its position internally. And so you have these oxen that are pushing these wagons, and they're snorting and struggling with this load. But of course, there's always blood. So it's almost like a symbol that, this work is not over. There's much more battles and much more struggle to endure to, again, live up to these burdens, but to also make sure that we are all moving America as a project forward. So again, just looking at what Lawrence himself hoped to achieve with this narrative series is that these would enlighten, these would bring forward the struggles of people that are underrepresented, and that, the American people are all contributing to this cause, and to really create a complex and inclusive understanding of America and American voices and all those that contribute to the cause. I know there was some interest in talking about how this show was curated, and so I'm going to quickly just sort of touch upon that. So we had this note to the visitor that once they entered the exhibition, it talked about why sort of some panels are missing. There are 5 panels that are missing. We don't know where they are, and they were represented in the gallery space with any information that we did know about them. So that black and white image was on the wall. All the reproductions of the works that were not original were unframed. And there were cues in the labels, whether it was an original or not original. And we made this choice at PEM to try to be transparent about where we were in this process of trying to find the missing panels. So here's an image of the last panels from this series, and they're all reproductions. But they all have sort of different situations of why they're reproductions. And so again, this panel here, which is black and white, we don't know where it is. We are using the last time it was reproduced, so that's why it's black and white. The Erie Canal painting, we don't know where it is, but we do know what colors Lawrence used because it was reproduced in a color photograph. And then panel 30, which I talked about ending this series, we do know where it is. Stanford University owns it, but unfortunately it has major condition issues and can't travel. So there's all these different layers and complexities that would go into what we choose to present and what would make the most sense, to the visitor. This is an installation image of the paintings at the Met. So again, as a curator, you always sort of want other venues to add their own spin to it, to create more meaning, and to really use it as an opportunity to reach their audiences. So these are the last 3 paintings of the Struggle series, and they decided to use this black and white graphic on the wall as a way to communicate what was not original, no matter what the sort of situation was. So it's sort of we know that it's missing here. And again, it's, just sort of a different take. All of this content, all this research, what happens is that you end up trying to gather all of these voices, first for the book, and then for the exhibition. So what we did when we were organizing the book is that we wanted to ask other people what they thought. What did they see in these paintings? And so we asked a ton of artists and scholars and other folks that were that were sort of on our radar that added more meaning than, you know, the curators could. And so this is an example of one of the pages in the publication where we ask an outside contributor to tell us what they see in these paintings. And then the curatorial contribution to these paintings talks about the historical event. So in this particular instance, artist and educator Steve Locke is talking about panel 1. He talks about it in relationship to the Oath of the Haredi. And again, all of this content adds fodder for what ends up being, you know, the label in the exhibition. We also produced a book where teenagers responded to the panel. So this exhibition is traveling nationally, and we asked the venues, the other museums, to connect us with teenagers that were part of their programs to look at these panels and tell us what they think, what they felt, how it related to their own experience. And so we were able to publish a teen book, a young adult book on the struggle, which again is really wonderful because it just continues to make meaning. And then I had also curated contemporary artists in Pem's presentation of the Struggle series. And 3 other venues are also including these contemporary artists. And that's a decision that we made to really emphasize how history is not a distant period of the past, but an active space that's really questioned in the present. And so each of these artists really look at one particular sort of conceptual pillar of the Struggle series and how they turn history into art. So Bethany Collins is looking at the history of words and how language shifts over time. Hank Willis Thomas is looking at the visual archive of American history. And then Derek Adams is looking at the history of place through time. And so again, it's all about, you know, making more meaning, adding more interpretation, more voices to contribute to a series of paintings by Jacob Lawrence that really demands this inclusive approach. So that's it for me. I just want to say thank you. This is just an image of, you know, a previous sort of work session I've had with students and connecting with colleges and classrooms. This is an amazing opportunity to continue to spread Jacob Lawrence, and I'm just really grateful for your participation. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Lydia. That was amazing.
That was, thank you.
And it's truly more than we could have hoped for or asked for. That's just so incredible, so well researched and in depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I know that we're kind of coming up on time. Anyone have any questions or anything for Lydia or about the exhibition?
Just want to say how grateful I am. I brought a class there last spring, and I actually really appreciate the way that you put the text and the images together, and it looks like make that same decision at the Met. Congratulations, it's a fabulous show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can ask a question, because the one with the Boston Massacre, with the fact that the people at the front line were, I don't know if they were formerly enslaved or they were part. Do you know anything about the?
Yeah, so Crispus Attucks was enslaved in Springfield, Massachusetts. His mother was of Native descent, and her community is escaping me right now. But he was able to purchase his freedom because he was in Massachusetts. And so we moved to Natick and then to Boston, and he worked as a ship hand on, in the yard. And, as we've seen it now, I mean, a lot of the Boston Massacre was because of economic duress, right? Like the the colonists that were working were not getting paid for, proper wages for their labor. And so, this sort of motley crew of colonists started rioting against the soldiers that were on what was King Street, which is, of course, now State Street. So yeah, I mean, there are so many accounts in the books, of addicts, but I think it's what content was chosen to be reproduced over and over and over again really communicated a dominant narrative that is not inclusive. And so Lawrence, he did so much research, over 5 years of research in the library before he even picked up a paintbrush, So yeah, the power of inserting those figures back, I think is pretty, it's a remarkable and political gesture.
I'm really interested in one of the points you made early on, which is the relationship to history painting, and just the kind of double activity that's going on here. One, getting away from the conceit that you can tell an entire story in a single panel, and so the multi-panel approach, but then also the role of the text, and that is really striking. So I was interested in your decision to make the text so large and to think about that as such an important part of the narrative. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your thought process there.
Sure. Yeah. It's really interesting because the Met actually decided to put all the title captions just on the wall label. So they're smaller, which, as long as they're there, like that was sort of the curatorial, like as long as the captions are there, because the struggle panels, even though they were sort of sold off individually, they have appeared in larger like Lawrence retrospectives, but not all together. Like there were like 3 panels here and 4 panels here or whatever, but the text was always severed from the paintings. And I don't think you can't really understand like the meaning or the multiple meaning without that relationship, without knowing, what account or whose words. I mean, these are first person accounts, which was strikingly different for Lawrence because he always wrote the captions for the other narratives in third person. So they were really important, to the artists, that these were a secondary component to the work of art. And so we made the decision to give them equal weight, physically, like on the wall, so that, folks would sort of look at the words and they were big enough to have a relationship with the painting. And again, I think that was just to, emphasize Lawrence as a researcher and really taking the time to dig through and find those, words and actions of those that had, been left out. I think the Met took a totally different approach, which is great, but they were really, they were focused on the visual. They were focused on having sort of the narrative sweep in a contained gallery. And at PAM, we don't have the space in terms of like a design. So we weren't able to necessarily have them all like wrap around one gallery, which the Met did. It does have, so that was sort of their emphasis. But I think, having those words up on the wall, Lawrence was really, he wanted the words and the images to be together. And we just hope that it inspired folks to like dig a little bit deeper into these, personal accounts that maybe they've heard of. Maybe folks have heard of Patrick Henry, but maybe not necessarily know that line from that particular speech. So.
And it also seemed like the contemporary artists that you chose were very engaged with the notion of research in their own contributions.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all of them are really looking at how to turn history into art, you know, using more sort of contemporary artistic solutions like installation or video and that. I mean, it was important to us that Lawrence was the only painter, right? He's like the master painter, center stage in the gallery. But all of the artists are interested in mining the archive. You know, that's where the work comes out of. And that's where the work came out of for Lawrence too. So it was important to have the archive not only like physically represented in the gallery space, but like on the walls too, you know, and also emphasize just how important like facts are and how important libraries are and archives and research, you know. And so, yes, I love that question. Thank you.
Hey, hi Lydia.
Hi.
I had to duck off briefly, but I've been listening behind Brian's back for the rest of the time. Thank you for this amazing exhibition and the presentation today. I really loved the point that you made. Well, the observation that is brought by the absence of the paintings that aren't there, and the conditions under which it was collected, because you know, you said the museums weren't ready, right? They weren't ready yet. And it strikes me that it's like the mid 1960s where the historian Jesse Lemlish comes up with this term, history from the bottom up. And it always, even going back to the migration series, it's just always moved me so much that Lawrence was doing that way before, you know, the historical field was even engaging in that, you know, and he was really like devoted to recovering this history of the common people, right? And it's so timely. I mean, was it last week that Trump, you know, declared we were gonna like ban Hispanic history? You know, this battle over how we tell our history is ongoing. And, you know, so it's just become even more timely as this year has gone on. And I really just appreciate the show so much and your talk today. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. That's so wonderful. I totally agree. Like, as I was sort of saying with Martha's question, like there's just so much power in the facts, you know, and there's so much power in research. And I think Lawrence really understood that from a very young age, that, you know, everything we need to know can be found, and we just need to do the work, right? Like, how many works of modern art start in the library? I don't know the answer to that question, but, you know, probably not a lot. And he just took such a different approach to, you know, creating something that was honestly, I think, meant for viewers like way beyond the 1950s. And I think that's also what makes it like such a great work of art, is that it is timeless, right? Like we can all still learn something from him. So yes, I agree.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Lydia. Thank all of y'all for being here. We're going to get this edited up, put on YouTube, and I can't wait for your class's reaction to all this information as well. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's so nice to see you all. Bye.